What it really was. The deadly fruit, why tomatoes were feared for 200 years. Target, 8 to 10 minutes. There is something sitting on your kitchen counter right now, or in your refrigerator, or sliced on a plate somewhere in your house. You eat it without a second thought. You put it in salads, you simmer it into sauces, you feed it to children. For most of the world, for most of recorded history, that was not something anyone did. Because for nearly 2 centuries, educated people, doctors, scientists, landowners, and farmers looked at the tomato and saw something dangerous. Not just unpleasant, not just unfamiliar, dangerous. They called it the poison apple. They grew it in ornamental gardens and refused to touch the fruit. Some believed eating it would kill a person within hours. Others thought it caused fever, caused madness, caused the body to corrupt from the inside. And here is the part that makes this strange. They were not entirely wrong. Today, the tomato is the most consumed fruit on the planet by production volume. The global tomato harvest exceeds 180 million metric tons per year. In Italy, the tomato feels ancient, inseparable from the cuisine, from the culture, from the landscape. In the United States, the average person consumes roughly 22 pounds of tomatoes per year in various forms. It is on every table, in every kitchen. It feels permanent. It feels inevitable. It feels like it was always there. It was not. To understand why people feared the tomato, you have to understand the world they were living in. In 16th century Europe, the science of plants was inseparable from the science of medicine. Herbalists and physicians were often the same person. The botanical world was being catalogued and classified for the first time in any systematic way, and the stakes were high. The wrong plant could kill you, not as a vague possibility, as a routine reality. Hemlock, mandrake, belladonna, nightshade, these plants were not abstract dangers. They were growing in hedgerows, in gardens, in the countryside where ordinary people walked. Entire families had been poisoned by mistaking a plant for something edible. So when a new plant arrived from the Americas, a plant no European had ever seen before, the instinct of every serious botanist, every careful physician was the same. Look at what it resembles. Look at its family, ask where it came from, and then be very careful. Spanish explorers encountered the tomato in Mesoamerica sometime in the early 1500s. The Aztecs had cultivated it. They called it tomatal. They cooked with it, combined it with other ingredients, treated it as a food source. When the Spanish brought it back to Europe in the 1520s and 1530s, something changed. The tomato entered a different world with different botanical knowledge and a different relationship to the unfamiliar. European herbalists began examining it almost immediately, and what they found made them cautious. The tomato belonged to the Solanaceae family, the Nightshade family. Its relatives included belladonna, mandrake, henbane. These were not neutral associations. These were some of the most feared plants in European botanical tradition. Belladonna could dilate the pupils, induce hallucinations, and in sufficient quantities cause death. Mandrake was bound up with legends of poison, witchcraft, and madness. The tomato looked like it belonged with them. In 1544, the Italian physician Pietro Andrea Mattioli published a herbal compendium that would become one of the most influential botanical texts in Europe. He grouped the tomato alongside mandrake. He acknowledged it was being eaten in some places, but he described it with visible unease. The name he gave it, in the tradition of the era, carried the warning inside it: mala insana, the unhealthy apple. Here is where the story becomes more complicated than a simple myth. The tomato's suspicious relatives were not just a matter of superstition. Tomato plants do contain toxic compounds. The leaves and stems contain solanine and tomatine, alkaloids that, in large quantities, can cause real harm. Animals that graze on tomato plants can become sick. The plants were not entirely safe to handle carelessly. The fruit itself, however, is not meaningfully toxic to humans. So why were people dying? Or more precisely, why did people in Northern Europe and in early America report illness and even death after eating tomatoes? The answer historians and food scientists have proposed may have had nothing to do with the tomato at all. It may have had everything to do with what the tomato was served on. Wealthy households in 17th and 18th century Europe 8 from pewter. Pewter plates, pewter bowls, pewter cups. Pewter was a mark of status. It was the material of the prosperous household. Pewter contains lead. Tomatoes are highly acidic. When an acidic food sits on a lead-containing surface, the acid leaches the lead into the food. The people who were eating tomatoes and becoming sick, the people who were eating tomatoes and dying, may have been suffering from lead poisoning, and they blamed the fruit. This is a hypothesis. The chemistry supports it clearly. The historical record does not offer a direct documented account that confirms this mechanism as the definitive cause in any specific death. But the pattern is there. Wealthier households with access to pewter reported more incidents. Poorer households, eating from wooden boards, eating the tomato in southern Europe, where the fruit had been incorporated into the cuisine generations earlier. They did not report the same deaths. They were eating the same fruit. The difference was the plate. The scientific name for the tomato carries this suspicion in its etymology. The older genus name was Lycopersicon. Lycos, wolf, persicon, peach. The wolf peach. Not a name you give something you trust. The naming reflected centuries of accumulated botanical anxiety, a fruit that looked beautiful, that smelled of its family's poison, that seemed to offer itself while its relatives killed. The wolf peach. It sat in ornamental gardens across England and northern Europe for most of the 1600s and much of the 1700s. People grew it, they tended it, they watched the fruit ripen, they did not eat it. The shift, when it came, was slow and uneven. In southern Europe, in Spain, in Italy, in Portugal, the tomato had already been incorporated into cooking by the late 1600s. The sauce, the condiment, the base ingredient. The tomato became part of those culinary traditions quietly and without drama, because in those regions the botanical fear had not taken the same hold, and the ornamental pewter plate was less universal. In England and northern Europe, the resistance lasted longer. In North America, the tomato was regarded with suspicion well into the early 1800s. Thomas Jefferson, who was among the most scientifically minded of the American founders and a serious gardener and agriculturalist, grew tomatoes at Monticello. He served them. This is documented. But Jefferson was unusual in his willingness to experiment, and his example did not immediately shift popular opinion. There is a story, popular, widely repeated, warmly told, of a man named Colonel Robert Gibbon Johnson, who stood on the steps of the courthouse in Salem, New Jersey in 1820 and ate a basket of tomatoes in front of a horrified crowd to demonstrate they were safe. It is a good story. Historians consider it largely a legend. There is no reliable contemporary documentation of the event. It may reflect a kernel of real local tradition, or it may be a story that grew in the telling because it captured something true about the era, the sense that someone, somewhere, had to stand up and eat the thing before anyone else would believe it. What is documented is the shift in cookbooks. American cookbooks and agricultural journals began including tomatoes with increasing frequency from the 1830s onward. By the 1850s, commercial tomato cultivation was underway. By the 1880s, the tomato was becoming ordinary. 200 years of suspicion, dissolved not by a single dramatic act, but by accumulated familiarity. The tomato is now so embedded in global food culture that it is difficult to imagine a cuisine without it. Italian food without tomatoes. Indian food without the tomato-based curries that came after it. The American hamburger without a slice on top. All of these traditions are younger than they feel. Italian tomato sauce, as a cultural institution, is not ancient. The widespread use of tomatoes in Italian cooking developed largely in the 18th and 19th centuries. What feels timeless is, in historical terms, recent. The fruit that was once called the wolf peach, the poison apple, the unhealthy fruit, the fruit that sat in ornamental gardens for a century and a half while people admired its color and refused to eat it, became the most cultivated fruit in the world. There is a version of this story that is about ignorance, about superstitious people who did not understand botany, who were afraid of something harmless. But that version is too simple. The people who were cautious about the tomato were not foolish. They were operating in a world where botanical misidentification genuinely killed people, where the price of being wrong about a plant was paid in illness and death, where a new and unfamiliar fruit from an unknown continent belonging to a family of poisons deserved careful attention. Their caution was rational. What was irrational was the mechanism they blamed, the fruit rather than the plate, the poison they could see rather than the one they could not. And there is something in that worth sitting with. The next time you hold a tomato, and notice how ordinary it feels, how completely unfrightening, how inconceivable it seems that anyone would ever have looked at this thing with fear. Remember that for 2 centuries, that is exactly what people did. And some of them were dying. And they were not entirely wrong to be careful. They just looked at the wrong thing.